I'm Dana Granger, and I was 32 the day my father parked my grandmother in an airport lounge like a bag he meant to lose. He smiled when he said it. Just sit here. We'll check in and come right back. My grandmother had Alzheimer's. She believed him for about 4 minutes. So did I. My parents thought leaving her in that lounge was the end of it. They had no idea the nurse they raised had already started writing down the time. What I did next is the reason a judge later looked my father in the eye and used the word unfit. This is the story of a one-way ticket nobody thought I'd read. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. Quiet stories about ordinary women, impossible families, and the line you finally decide no one gets to cross again. If that's your kind of story, settle in, pour the coffee, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. I grew up with 2 families inside one. There were my parents in Lincoln in a house with a 3-car garage and a lawn that got mowed in diagonal stripes. And there was my grandmother Edith on 160 acres outside Kearney, 2 hours west on I-80. My father Raymond sold insurance and smelled like cologne and certainty. My mother Carol ran the house like a showroom. They loved photographs of the family more than the work of being one. Grandma loved the work. She taught me to weed a lavender row before I could read. She hummed old hymns over the sink and let me stay up past bedtime shelling bass. When I became a geriatric nurse, people said I had a gift for the elderly. I just had Edith. By the time I tell you about, I was between travel contracts, living alone in a small rental on the east side of Lincoln, which is a polite way of saying I was the one with time. In families like mine, the one with time becomes the one with the job. Grandma had been moved off the farm a year earlier into my parents' guest room, so we can help her, Mom said. I should have heard the quotation marks. The strange part started small. My mother, who hated dirt under her nails, suddenly wanted to talk about the farm, land values, acreage, whether the old place was really worth keeping. I chalked it up to stress. Caregiving wears people thin, and I knew that better than anyone. So I told myself she was tired, not scheming. That's the thing about the people you love. You give them the benefit of the doubt long after they've stopped earning it. And I gave mine right up until the gate agent called the flight. The week before the trip, my father asked me a question that didn't belong in his mouth. Do you happen to know where the deed to the farm is kept? We were at their kitchen island, he asked. It the way you'd ask about a spare key. I said I didn't, and watched him not be disappointed enough. 2 days later, my mother floated a brochure across the same counter, a memory care community, glossy, with a fountain on the cover. It would be so good for her, she said. Professionals around the clock. I'm a nurse. I know good memory care exists, and I know it costs money. The brochure never prints. So I did what I tell any family to do. I asked to see the paperwork. I asked which facility, what the admission date was, whether they'd toward it. I said I wanted to care all of us at one table before anything moved. My mother smiled and changed the subject to the trip. That was the new plan, apparently. A family reconciliation trip to Arizona. The 4 of us plus Grandma to look at a condo they were thinking of buying. It sounded almost sweet. It sounded like the kind of thing functional families do. I had a bad feeling, the low kind that sits under your ribs, but I had no proof and no good reason to refuse a trip framed as healing. So I said yes, and I told myself I'd ask my questions again at the Gotta. Here's the part one want you to hear, because I replayed it 1,000 times. I saw the warning. I asked the questions. I just didn't know they'd already bought the ticket that made my questions too late. Epley Airfield in Omaha is an hour up the interstate from Lincoln, and we made it in good time on a Tuesday morning. Grandma sat between me and the window of the rental car, holding my hand the whole way, her fingers cool and smelling of the lavender hand cream she'd used my entire life. At the airport, she got nervous the way she did in crowds. So I kept her close while my parents handled the bags. We ended up in one of the lounges near the gates, the kind with low chairs and a coffee machine and too much glass. My father settled Grandma into a chair by the window. He crouched in front of her, took both her hands, and used his warmest voice, the one he saved for clients. Just sit here, he said. We'll check in and come right back. She nodded like a child being good. I almost let it go, but the bad feeling under my ribs stood up and spoke. So I told my parents I'd be right back and stepped 20 feet away to make a call. On my way, I noticed my father stop at the gate desk and lean in to say a few quiet words to the young agent behind it. I figured he was checking on our seats. I phoned the memory care community on the brochure, the one in Arizona, to confirm the arrangements I'd never been shown. A pleasant woman put me on a brief hold. Then she came back and said the words that rearranged my life. Ma'am, I'm sorry. We have no admission under that name. We have no record of any Granger at all. I turned around mid-sentence. The chairs where my parents had been sitting were empty. Their carry-ons were gone. My grandmother sat alone by the window exactly where she'd been told to, her purse in her lap and a folded boarding pass in her hand, waiting for two people who had already walked through security and out of her life. Just sit here. We'll come right back. They never intended to come back at all. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't. Something in me went very quiet and very fast at the same time, the way it does in a code when there's no room left for feeling and only room for doing. I crossed the lounge, but the chair by the window was empty now, too. For one terrible second, I thought they'd taken her after all, or that she'd wandered. Then I heard it under the gate. Announcements and the rolling luggage. Humming low and tuneless and absolutely hers. My grandmother hummed when she was frightened, the same old hymn her whole life, the one my late grandfather used to sing to her in the garden. I followed the sound around a bank of chairs and found her standing near the window, showing a folded photograph to a young woman in airline uniform. And this is my Walter, Grandma was telling her, pointing at a man 6 years dead. He sings to me. The gate agent looked up at me with the kind, helpless face people get around dementia. I told her I was family, that I was a nurse, that I had her. And then my grandmother turned and for a moment the fog lifted the way it sometimes did, sudden and bright and cruelly brief. She looked at me, really looked, and her whole face softened. There you are, she said. I knew you'd come back. I have caught newborns and pressed on stopped hearts and signed the bottoms of death certificates with steady hands. My hands were not steady. Then I knelt down in front of her, took the boarding pass out of her fingers and folded it once more into a small hard square. I put in my own pocket, a one-way ticket to a city she had no reason to fly to, bought for a woman who would be found alone and become someone else's problem. They thought she wouldn't understand what had happened to her. The trouble was I understood it perfectly. There's a version of the story where I fall apart in that lounge and I'd understand it, but I had a confused, dehydrated 82-year-old in front of me and panic doesn't help a patient. So I worked. I got her sitting again, got water into her in small sips, checked her color, checked her pulse at the wrist out of habit. She was tired and rattled, but physically all right. Then I did the thing that nursing beats into you over 1,000 bad nights. I started writing down the time. I opened the notes on my phone and logged it. The hour we arrived. The time my father said, we'll come right back. The time the facility told me there was no admission. The time I found her alone. I photographed the empty chairs. I photographed the boarding pass front and back before it went in my pocket. I called my father. It rang twice and went to voicemail. which means he saw my name, and pressed the side button. I called my mother. A text came back within a minute. And I've kept it. Don't make this dramatic. We've earned a rest. She's in good hands with you. Earned a rest. Good hands, as if abandoning a woman with Alzheimer's in an airport were a spa day they budgeted for. I sat with my grandmother's head against my shoulder while she hummed herself calm, and I felt something settle in me that has never fully left. Not rage. Rage is loud and useless. This was quieter and far more dangerous to them. It was the cold, clear focus of someone who knows exactly how systems work and has just decided to use every one of them. They'd left a paper trail without meaning to, and I am very, very good with paper. The first practical problem was where to take her. I couldn't bring her back to my parents' house in Lincoln. They weren't there. They'd boarded their own flight to Phoenix to go look at the retirement condo, the one this whole family trip had really been about. I learned that later, but I suspected it in the parking garage. So I drove us the hour back down to Lincoln to my little rental and got her settled on my couch with a blanket and the TV turned low. She slept 12 hours. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I knew that my apartment wouldn't hold. It was small. It had stairs. And worst of all, it was strange to her. And strangest is the enemy in dementia. There was only one place on earth my grandmother's brain still trusted. The farm. I wasn't naive about how it might look. I'm a nurse, and I knew that moving a woman who couldn't consent carried its own risks, and that my father would find a way to call it kidnapping. But you do not hand a vulnerable patient back to the people who abandoned her 12 hours earlier, not when her safety is the whole question. And I decided I'd get a lawyer on the phone before I did one more thing I couldn't defend. So once she'd eaten, I packed a bag, buckled her in, and pointed the car west. 2 hours on I-80, with the flat gold fields rolling by. Kearney exit coming up like an old promise. The farmhouse key was where it had always been, under the loose brick by the propane tank, and it still turned the lock. Inside, the air smelled like dust and dried lavender and the particular mustiness of a house missing its person. Grandma walked in, set her purse on the same hook she'd used for 50 years, and her shoulders came down 2 inches. I'll start the coffee, she said, clear as a bell, and went to a kitchen she suddenly remembered. I stood in the doorway and watched her hands find the percolator without her eyes. The disease takes so much, but the body holds the places we loved the longest. I didn't know yet what I'd have to fight to keep her here. I just knew I wasn't taking her anywhere else. The farm told on them before the family did. I spent that first day opening windows and wiping a year of grime off the counters, half listening as Grandma drifted between the present and 1974. She told me about Walter, about the garden, about the lavender rose she'd planted for the bees and for the smell of a thing that doesn't quit. Not one word about lawyers or money. Whatever my parents were after, she wasn't guarding it. She'd long since let it go where the rest of her recent life had gone. Then I cleared the stack of mail and circulars off the kitchen table, and underneath it, I found something that stopped my hands. A glossy folder from a Really company in Nay, Prairie Line Really. Inside was a comparative market analysis on the farm, the full 160 acres, complete with an estimated sale price that had a comma in a place that made my stomach turn. Clipped to it was a draft listing agreement, half filled out and signed, dated 3 weeks earlier, with my father's name typed in the seller line. He'd gotten the agent that far. I would learn later by telling her he was about to be appointed to handle his mother's affairs, which was simply a lie. 3 weeks before the trip, before the lounge, my parents had walked a stranger across my grandmother's land, taken photographs of her home, and priced it for sale. And they had never once asked the woman who owned it. They hadn't asked her because they couldn't. She couldn't understand the question anymore, which raised the only question that mattered to me standing there in her kitchen with her humming in the next room. If my grandmother couldn't consent to sell her own farm, then by what authority did my father think he could sell it for her? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew exactly who to call to find out. My parents were back from Arizona within 3 days, and the phone call started. Immediately, my mother went first, all warmth and reason. Sweetheart, this has gone far enough. Bring her back to Lincoln. You're not equipped to do this alone. I almost laughed. I do this for a living. My father took a harder line. You don't get to just take her, Dana. There are decisions being made for her welfare, and you're interfering. Decisions made for her welfare by the people who'd left her in a lounge. But it was my Uncle Wes who told the truth. Because Wes has never been able to hold a thought in without it spilling out the bottom. Wes ran an auto shop down in Grand Island, and Wes had money problems. The family pretended not to see. He called me himself, skipping the pleasantries. Look, the farm has to sell this quarter. It just does. So whatever you think you're doing, you're costing all of us. There it was. Not her welfare, the quarter. I asked Wes as evenly as I could how exactly they plan to sell a farm that belonged to a living woman who hadn't agreed to anything. He went quiet, then said something that turned the low feeling under my ribs into a plan. Your dad's handling that. There's a process. We just need her looked at by a doctor. Declared you. No, then it's clean declared. They wanted her declared incompetent, not to protect her, but to take the wheel of her estate and drive it straight to a closing table. My mother let the same words slip on the next call, dressed up nicer. A competency evaluation. It's just paperwork, Dana. It is never just paperwork. And I was about to make sure they learned that the expensive way. I didn't argue with them anymore after that. Arguing is what they wanted. Because an argument is just noise, and noise goes nowhere. Instead, I called a lawyer, not a flashy one, an elder law attorney in Kearney named Gene Howerin, a man in his late 60s who'd been practicing in Buffalo County since before I was born, and who answered his own phone. I told him everything in order, the way I'd been trained to give. Report at a shift change, the trip, the lounge, the phone call to the facility. That didn't exist, the boarding pass. The listing agreement dated 3 weeks before the flight, the competency evaluation they wanted. He let me finish without interrupting, which is its own kind of mercy. Then he said something that told me I'd called the right man. You did 3 things right in the first hour that most families never think to do. You wrote down the times. You took photographs, and you kept her with you instead of handing her back. He paused. And no, taking her somewhere safe wasn't kidnapping, no matter what your father says. When the people responsible for a vulnerable adult abandon her, getting her to safety is exactly what the law expects. We'll paper it properly, and we'll do it fast. Then quieter. Tell me, you kept the boarding pass. I told him. It was in my wallet, that very minute. I want to pause here, because some of you watching know exactly how this feels. You're the one who shows up. You're the one everyone calls when it's hard, and somehow never when it's easy. You've been told you're good at this, which is how families turn a person into a service. If that's you, stay with me. Because this is the part where she stops being the only one who shows up and starts being the one who's ready. Subscribe so the next quiet woman carrying her whole family can find this story when she needs it. Now back to Mr. Howerin and what he told me about the law. Before I tell you the law, I have to tell you what it cost, because nothing about this was clean or easy. My parents got to the family first. They were always better at the story than at the truth. By the end of that week, half the relatives believed I had taken Grandma in some fit of drama, that I'd cut her off from her loving son and daughter-in-law, that I was unstable Overworked, maybe a little unwell. My father is very good at looking. Concerned. My mother cries on cue against. Two people who look that good in church. Clothes. A tired nurse who works nights. Doesn't stand a chance in the rumor. Mel. My phone filled with messages from aunts and cousins, some confused, some cold. One great aunt called to tell me, in a voice dripping with worry, that my mother was just sick about the money. Your spending of Edith's. That one. Landed, I'll admit, because here's my particular weakness, the one I've had to learn the hard way. I am the woman who does everything alone. I don't ask for help. I don't build a team. I carry it and tell myself that needing no one is the same as being strong. So when the family closed ranks against me, my first instinct wasn't to call allies. I didn't have any either. Spent my whole life being the one others leaned on, and I never once practiced leaning back. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen that night, feeling more outnumbered than I'd ever felt in my life, with one confused old woman asleep down the hall and a folder full of paper that I wasn't yet sure was enough. And then I remembered the one thing they kept saying. They kept saying she wouldn't know, and I started to understand that they had no idea what she knew. I went back through every message and a call from the weeks before the trip, reading them the way you read a chart on a patient who crashed, looking for the moment it all went wrong. And there it was in a voicemail my mother had left me the night before we drove to Omaha, one I'd only half listened to at the time. She'd been talking fast, the way she does when she's convinced herself of something. Honestly, Dana, the doctors say she's barely there. She won't even know we're gone. She won't even know we're gone, he said. With that for a long time, there was a text thread, too, that I shouldn't have been able to see but could because my father had once added me to a family group and never removed me. He'd written it to Wes weeks earlier, casual as anything. Don't worry about Mom. The farm's basically mine anyway. Just need to move her along. The farm's basically mine anyway. Just need to move her along. Move her along. Like cattle, like inventory, like a chair you carry to the curb. And underneath the disgust, something useful clarified for me. This wasn't a family that had cracked under the unbearable weight of caregiving, though they'd certainly tell the judge it was. This was a calculation they had decided in advance, and in writing that an old woman's mind was gone, that her land was theirs, and that the most efficient way to collect was to lose her somewhere far away and let the state sort it out. They had done the math on her. What they'd forgotten is that I do math too, and the most expensive miscalculation they made wasn't the listing agreement or the one-way ticket. It was the assumption hiding under every cruel word. They thought she would know. She knew. She knew exactly who walked away and exactly who came back. I won't pretend caring for her was easy, because that would dishonor everyone watching this who actually does it. The nights were the worst. Dementia gets louder when the sun goes down. They call it sundowning, and there's no chart that prepares you for the woman who raised you not knowing your face at 2 o'clock in the morning. She'd get up, frightened, looking for Walter, looking for a baby. Long grown. The thing that worked, the only thing, was her own garden. I'd take her hands and rub the lavender cream into them, the same scent from the same brand she'd used for 40 years, and I'd walk her to the back window where her lavender rose used to be. They'd gone to seed and weed in the years she was away, gray and leggy and half dead in the dark. But she'd look at them and something in her would quiet, and she'd tell me every time, as if for the first time, that lavender is the one plant that smells better after you cut it back. I started to think she was telling me something more than gardening. In the middle of one of those nights, headlights swung across the kitchen. My Uncle Wes unannounced 11 o'clock, just wanting to talk. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to walk through the house. I watched him drift toward the old roll Top desk, opening drawers, lifting. Papers, his eyes hunting. Finally, he turned to me and asked the question that told me how blind they were flying. Where does she keep the deed, Dana? We can't find the deed to the farm. Anywhere. I almost smiled. They'd planned to sell 160 acres, and they didn't even have the paper that said it was theirs to sell because it wasn't. And they were about to find out exactly how it wasn't. The thing that changed everything wasn't a letter or a secret will. It was 30 seconds of grainy footage. Mr. Howaren had told me to report the abandonment to Adult Protective Services, and I had the very next day to a caseworker named Marion Doyle. Marion had 30 years of watching families do terrible things to their elders, and nothing in my story surprised her, which was somehow the most chilling part. She moved faster than I expected. She requested the airport security footage before it could cycle off the system, and a week later, she called and asked me to come in and watch it with her. I want to be honest about what I expected. I expected confusion, a crowded lounge, a misunderstanding, maybe even an accident. I could have forgive. That is not what the camera showed. The camera showed my father crouching in front of my grandmother and taking her hands exactly as I remembered. It showed him stand, say something, and pat her shoulder. Then it showed him turn and walk away. And here is the detail I will carry to my own grave, halfway across that lounge, with his mother sitting alone. Behind him, my father lifted his wrist and checked his watch. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was on schedule. My mother appeared at the edge of the frame, glanced back once, and the two of them walked together towards security without breaking stride. The way you leave a gate, not the way you leave your mother. Marion let the clip run to the end, then froze it on the empty chair. I've done this a long time, she said quietly. That's not a family that fell apart. That's a plan. I asked her to print the still of him checking his watch. It wasn't a confused old woman wandering off. It was a man on his way somewhere, glancing at the time, leaving the woman who raised him behind, like a layover he didn't intend to make. I drove to Howard's office with the still photo in a folder and asked him to teach me the rules, all of them, so I'd never again be the last to understand my own family's plan. He poured bad coffee and walked me through it slowly. My grandmother, he explained, no longer had the capacity to sign anything. That door was closed. She couldn't grant me power of attorney now any more than she could sell the farm to my father. The only lawful path left ran through the courthouse, and it had two parts. Guardianship, which is authority over the person where she lives and how she's cared for, and conservatorship, which is authority over the property, the money, and the land. A court appoints both, he said, and the court's only loyalty is to her best interest. People assume the son gets it automatically. He told me he doesn't. The judge weighs who's suitable, and the court can pass right over a closer relative if that person is unfit or if their interests collide with hers. Then he said the sentence that turned the whole thing around in my chest. A conservator can't simply sell awards real estate to pay his own debts. Selling her land takes a separate petition and the judge's approval. No court in this state signs off on selling Grandma's farm to bail out her son's auto shop. I sat there and let it sink in. My parents' entire scheme rested on a foundation that didn't exist. They thought losing her would hand them the land. Instead, the act of losing her was the single best evidence I could possibly bring to a judge deciding who was fit to protect her. Their weapon and my weapon were about to turn out to be the same thing. They just didn't know I was the one holding it. That night, I took the boarding pass out of my wallet and really looked at it the way you look at an X-ray once you know what the shadow means. I'd been carrying it as a wound. Now I started reading it as a record. It was one way, not round trip, not part of a family vacation package, but a single seat going one direction to a city my Grandmother had no reason on earth to fly to Alone, and printed along the bottom was the purchase date. It had been bought 11 days before the trip. 11 days before the smiles, before the family reconciliation, before my father crouched down and promised he'd come right back. He had already purchased a one-way ticket that would carry his mother somewhere far from home, where a confused woman found Alone would be processed by strangers and quietly become a ward of some other county. The trip wasn't reconciliation. The trip was logistics. I called Mary and Doyle the next morning and told her about the purchase date and asked whether the airline kept records of who bought the ticket and when. She said they did, and that with the abandonment report open, those records could be requested through the proper channels along with the camera footage. Already in hand, I added it to the folder. The folder was getting thick now, and every page in it was something my parents had created themselves and handed to me without realizing. The listing agreement they'd signed, the voicemail my mother left, the text my father sent, the footage, the ticket. I hadn't dug up a single secret. I had simply refused to throw away anything they gave me, and they were about to give me one more gift. They were about to take me to court. They struck first the way people do when they think speed looks like confidence. I was served on a Thursday, standing in my grandmother's kitchen, with flour on my hands by a processed server who looked genuinely sorry about it. My father and my uncle had filed a petition for guardianship and conservatorship of Edith Granger. Their petition named me, of course, according to the paperwork. I was the problem. I had removed the ward from her established residence, isolated her from her immediate family, and was exercising undue influence over a vulnerable adult, likely it implied, to get my hands on her estate. I had to read it twice, because the gall of it took a minute to register. The two people who had bought a one-way ticket and left her in an airport were petitioning a court to protect her from me. The arsonist had called the fire department to report the homeowner. I'll tell you the honest truth about how it felt. For about an hour, it felt like losing. They had money for lawyers and a story polished by years of telling. I had a folder and a night shift nurse's salary and a grandmother who couldn't testify on her own behalf. But how Aaron, when I called him and something close to panic sounded almost pleased. Good, he said. Let them file. Now there's a hearing. Now a judge has to look at all of it in one room on the record, and Dana, everything they did to her gets entered into evidence whether they like it or not. A hearing, a date on the calendar, one room, one judge, and every piece of paper they'd ever created laid side by side with their faces. I stopped feeling like I was losing. I started getting ready. The lawyer they hired was the expensive kind, and his first move was to suggest through Aaron that we could all make this go away quietly if I returned Grandma and stepped aside. His second move when I declined was to start hinting at things about me, that I was unstable, that night shift workers are unreliable, that a single woman who inserted herself into an inheritance had obvious motives. I felt the old urge rise up, the urge to fight dirty back, to dig into my father's debts and my uncle's failing shop and my mother's pile cabinet, to throw mud until everyone was filthy. Aaron talked me out of it in one sentence. You don't win this by proving they're bad people, he said. You win it by proving you're the safe one. So we built a file, not a smear. We gathered the things a judge actually weighs. We got a formal capacity evaluation from her physician, documenting exactly what she could and couldn't understand, so no one could pretend I was hiding a competent woman. I printed my care log, every medication and meal and bad night, dated and timed, in a nurse's plain hand. We had the APS report, the camera still, the airline purchase records, the listing agreement, the voicemail, the text, and we had my license. My 12 years of caring for Exactly this kind of patient. My whole, boring, competent life laid out as the thing it had always quietly been. A qualification. I wasn't going to walk into that courtroom hut. I was going to walk in prepared the way I walk into every room where someone's life is on the line. Let them bring the theater. I was bringing the truth in a binder with tabs. I gained 2 witnesses in the weeks before the hearing, and neither one was family, which tells you something about my family. The first was the gate agent. Her name was Teresa, and she was the young woman my grandmother had shown the photograph to in the lounge. Marion Doyle had tracked her down through the airline. Teresa remembered the whole thing because how do you forget it? She remembered an elderly woman, clearly confused, sitting alone, and a man and woman she'd seen leave her there. She remembered most of all something my father had said to her at the desk on his way past. Almost as an aside, he'd told her in case anyone asked that someone would be along for the older lady. Someone, not her granddaughter, is right there, just someone eventually to deal with the older lady. Teresa agreed to say so under oath. My second witness was old Mr. Vogel, the Granger's nearest neighbor for 60 years, whose land ran up against ours. He couldn't speak to airports or paperwork, but he could speak to who Edith was and who'd showed up. He told me how every spring he used to hear my grandfather singing that same hymn to Grandma out in the lavender at dawn, the one she still hummed when she was scared. He told me Edith had asked about me by name all year, even as the rest of her slipped, even in the house in Lincoln when my parents told her I was too busy to visit, that one I had to sit down for. They'd told her I'd abandoned her, all while planning to abandon her themselves. She'd hummed her way through it, holding on to a granddaughter she'd been told wasn't coming. And then one day in an airport, that granddaughter came back. My mother came to the farm alone a week before the hearing. I almost didn't let her in, but she stood on the porch, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. And some stubborn part of me still wanted to understand. So I put the kettle on. She didn't ask to see Grandma. She sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in my life she told me the truth, or her version of it. You don't know what this year was. She said she got up at 3 every night. She didn't know me. She called me a thief in my own house. I gave up everything to care for her, and she looked at me like a stranger. And here is the part one won't lie about, because the story isn't honest. Otherwise, for a moment I felt for her. Caregiving without help breaks people. I've watched it break stronger people than my mother. The exhaustion in her face was real. The grief was real. If she had said the next words and I broke, and I'm sorry, I might have found a way to forgive her. She didn't. She wiped her eyes, straightened her spine, and said, so you have to understand. She wouldn't have known the difference. She won't even know we're gone. There. It was again. The same words, the same math. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking me to agree that what they'd done was reasonable because the cost to her had been high. I sat down my cup. Mom, I said. She knew exactly who walked away, and she knew exactly who came back. You still don't understand what the problem is, do you? She left without finishing her tea. I never doubted again. After she left, I made the decision that the whole rest of my life would hang on. I had a choice, and how Aaron laid it out fairly. We could settle. They might, under the weight of the evidence, agree to drop their petition and quietly let me keep her if I agreed to keep the worst of it out of the record. Or we could go to the hearing and put all of it in front of a judge on the record, in public with my parents in the room. The quiet way would protect the family name. The loud way would protect every other family that has someone like my grandmother and someone like my father. I thought about Teresa, who remembered. An old woman alone. I thought about Marion, who'd watched that footage with 30 years of practice and called it a plan. I thought about the listing Agreement dated 3 weeks before the smiles, and I decided that the family name had been protecting the wrong people for far too long. I'd take her home to this farm legally and for good, and I'd do it in the daylight where everyone could see. I want to say something to you directly because I know who's watching. Somewhere out there is a woman about to step away from her own relative to make one quick phone call, trusting the people standing closest to her. If that's you, read the paperwork before the plane boards. Check the dates, keep the receipts, and subscribe, because these stories have a way of reaching the exact person who's about to need them. The hearing got moved up after that because of the open abandonment report. The court wanted answers fast. So did I. The closer we got to the date, the more desperate they grew, and desperation makes people careless. Uncle Wes was the crack in the dam. His auto shop in Grand Island was further gone than the family had let on. The bank had called his note, and his entire plan for staying afloat had been his share of the farm sale. Money he'd been counting as good as banked for months. With the sale frozen, Wes was weeks from losing the shop he'd built over 20 years. So Wes leaned on my father hard, and my father, who could not afford his own life, either leaned back. I heard about it secondhand from a cousin who'd finally started to wonder why the loving son was so frantic to sell his confused mother's land. Their lawyer